I'm going to give pretty much a flying tour of digital transformation in law and how technology is really changing the way that law works. Now, I'm talking predominantly about the legal profession and legal services, but also a little bit about in general terms. And a lot of it, I'm afraid, it's a bit bleak. But let's start off. I've obviously got Bender from Futurama to show a robo-lawyer there, even though he's not a lawyer. Let's go a bit more highbrow, with a quote from Leibniz, who says, "It is unworthy of excellent men to lose hours like slaves in the labor of calculation, which could safely be relegated to anyone else if machines were used." He was an early adopter of technology and having robots take over. And I've always been a proponent of that. I've been very much in favor, except that as I was preparing for this talk, I was reading the newspaper just last week, and I saw this headline. This was in the Times. The legal editor said, lawyers with brain chip implants will be better, faster, and cheaper, suggesting that the Law Society, of all people, the people who are meant to be looking after lawyers in the UK, thought that maybe having chips implanted in lawyers' brains to make them work more efficiently, making them record billable units of attention, would be demanded by corporate clients. And I suddenly thought, is the future of lawyers essentially we're all going to be robots? I mean, some lawyers, you can't really tell the difference between them and robots anyway. Is this what the future is going to be looking like? Now, hopefully not. What I want to talk about, though, is law tech. So it became cool years ago to put the word tech on the end of everything, and it would make it automatically cool, and law is no exception. But a lot of people talk about law tech but don't know what it is. To a certain extent, it's a use of artificial intelligence at its most sophisticated. It's least sophisticated. It's just automating tasks that lawyers do that are repetitive or dull or expensive in some cases. Now, if you just a quick primer on AI, artificial intelligence essentially is where you're using machine learning. You're training a computer to do something that a human would normally do. You will do this essentially by training it through programs and algorithms. And as it does more of these tasks, it will learn from them and get better at it, much the same as in theory, a trainee solicitor would if you're training someone up. So AI-assisted law tech is, I think, one of the biggest developments in making lawyers' lives easier. And for lawyers' lives get easier, then their clients' lives get easier too. And it's quite an advanced concept, which is already well used. AI is being used in all other areas of our lives. Your bank will be using AI, governments using AI, all sorts of people using AI. But law's always got this bit of a crusty image. So it's annoying that whenever you mention a judge or a lawyer, this is the image that people often see. And the guy in the middle appears to be asleep. So I don't know exactly what they talk about. I hope I don't get into trouble for this, but criticizing judges here. But there we go. But the perception of law as a profession is one that, to be honest, is a bit sort of old and dusty, not really up to date with the times, not really understanding what's going on in society, and sort of living in an ivory tower. And that isn't really true. Now, lawyers, if you've ever come across a lawyer and they work as a lawyer, then chances are they will either work in a law firm, in private practice, or they are in-house. So if you're a private practice lawyer, you work in a law firm, and you have various things you have to do. Now, the most obvious ones of those are doing client work. But your goal is to win new business, manage teams, manage your clients, make sure you keep up to date with professional requirements, doing all the admin stuff that comes with being a private practice lawyer, doing your training. But the most important thing, anyone who's ever existed in a law firm will know that the most important thing in the views of the people who are in charge of you is that you hit your hourly targets. You do enough billable hours, not just to keep the firm rolling over and keep it going, but to make a lot of money and keep your bosses happy. Now, an in-house lawyer is almost the same in that you're advising the business. The client is essentially the company you're working for. You have the same professional requirements. You still advise the client, except it's only one client. You do all the business admin. But your goal is not to maximize your billable hours, but rather to get the best result for your business. So you're kind of working for one client. You don't really care how long it takes, how much time you spend on it. You just have to get the best results. It's very different. And this is a challenge that will cause problems for legal tech. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, if you are a lawyer, and I'm sure there's some lawyers on this call, you have a lot of competing demands on your attention. So you've got to make sure that you're productive all the time to hit those targets. You can find that you're dealing with lots of complicated tasks for different clients. You can find that some days your diary can be so chock-a-block you don't know if you're actually going to have time to breathe, let alone do all the work you have to do. You've then got to manage all of the documents. It's a very traditionally paper-heavy job to be a lawyer. But at the same time, you are in the service industry. It's in some ways not that different from working as a waiter or working in a hotel, and that if you don't keep your clients happy, they will ditch you. And of course, there's massive competition from other law firms, from in-house lawyers who will do the work themselves if you're a private practice lawyer, but also alternative legal service providers, some of which are using technology. And there's been a lot of legal startups that are using technology to try and take some of the work away from lawyers. And a lot of this is using AI. Now, the sort of things that you find in AI are things like legal chatbots. So you will have a chatbot, much as if you were speaking to, say, an Amazon chat assistant, or actually so many people using chatbots these days, that will get some items from you of what you want to do. Say you want to write a letter challenging a parking ticket is a good example, and it will create a template for you. There's also legal applications that will try and give you tips on negotiation, creating a playbook if you're actually in some sort of mediation or in a court case. You can have virtual assistants instead of having the traditional role of a PA. And I remember working with someone who literally would have dropped dead if her PA was not around. She couldn't print anything. She couldn't email anything. She actually dictated emails for her PA to type out, print out, show her. Then she'd amend them by hand to give them back for them to send. But the PA role can be replaced with a virtual assistant. There's e-discovery. So if you're going to court or you're doing research, there's the heavy task of actually plowing through documentation, plowing through books, plowing through materials. That can all be done through artificial intelligence, automation. And there's also things like legal analytics and prediction tools. There was a story a couple of years ago where they used AI to try and guess the outcome of a number of cases just by feeding them previous cases. And the results are quite impressive. So in theory, it would be possible to use AI to predict whether or not a case is worth taking on and whether or not you're going to win. And we will see. But there's problems. So AI and law tech, whilst there's lots of applications, a lot of things you can use, there are some issues with it. Now, that they're not necessarily that the robots are going to take over the world and kill everybody, which is a bit of a sci-fi nightmare. But there are some real problems that are actually not just theoretical, not just science fiction, but something that we see today. First off is if you're using any technology, but particularly if you're using artificial intelligence, then you will find there may be some bias involved. If you create an AI tool, then most likely it will carry the biases of whatever it's trained on, whatever its creators have put into it. So you could find a good example of this, and this isn't a legal one, is Microsoft put together an AI bot to go onto Twitter a few years ago. And it was trained by users on Twitter, and it immediately became offensively racist to everyone, swearing at everyone, and just a nasty piece of work and had to be taken down. So it was trained to do horrible things. This can happen essentially in terms of when you're using any sort of AI tool. The other issue is what happens if something goes wrong with AI? Who's liable? Now, this isn't an example that would be found in private practice, but in the US, they currently use AI in some states for sentencing. So when a judge is trying to work out how long somebody should go to prison for, whether they should be entitled to bail, they use an AI sentencing tool. It's a bit like a robo judge. It doesn't look anything like this, I'm afraid. That's kind of more cool than that. But there we go. But the issue is, because it carries some bias, it's going on previous records, it will discriminate. It will discriminate essentially against a person of color. It will assume that they're more likely to skip bail, so it will not grant them bail. And judges are using this, which is a tool that essentially is there to try and guide them into making the right decision, and just using it as, yep, we'll agree with whatever it says. Suddenly the AI takes control, a little bit like HAL in 2001, for those who get the reference. But it's called Compass. It's used to create risk scores for defendants to try and work out how likely they are to reoffend. And this is an issue, and it's a similar issue in that it will come up whenever you're using AI in legal research. It will point you to a decision that may have been seen before. You may lose a bit of your own innovation in that you're not necessarily thinking outside the box, but you're thinking in an AI-powered box. The other issue is what happens if you use AI and it goes wrong. Now, there are various things going on, not just in Hong Kong, but around the world, in terms of trying to stop AI being used without human interaction. So there's concern on how the algorithm is trained. There's concern that decisions are being made about people's lives without that essentially AI being checked. And we've already got in Hong Kong guidance on the ethical use of artificial intelligence. The European Union is big on this now. They're very concerned about automated decision making where AI makes decision. And so you will see this being a concern in law as well. And what tools am I actually using at the moment? So the sort of things that I use within my work, the tools that we actually have within my firm and in other firms where I've worked, generated either something we bought off the shelf, something we bought from a third party, or more often we're finding that law firms and indeed in-house teams, probably more in-house teams, have their own data scientist team, have their own computer scientist team, have programmers to create tools for them. So I use tools to automate document discovery. So essentially when I get a load of documents, I will have a tool to filter through them first, rather than sending some poor trainee to sit in a room for hours, filtering through dusty, rather boring documents. We use the same AI type of tools for research. To a certain extent, they're used for generation of documents and precedents. We definitely use AI, and I would be wary of anyone who didn't these days in terms of managing our clients and our contacts, of keeping up to date as who we should be speaking to, reminding you that you may not have contacted someone for a while and you should reach out to them. Training, I actually produced for a client a training tool that was focused on teaching all of the lawyers within the organization about technology and how technology works. We also use, although we don't use it enough, AI in billing, in terms of generating invoices and trying to figure out whether time is excessive or something shouldn't be there. And to a certain extent, virtual lawyers, though I don't really see many of those, and I'll tell you why in a second. The issue is, if something goes wrong, who's liable? Who's liable if you use AI and something fails? Well, there isn't really any real guidance on this yet. It's the same issue we've got with automated cars when they fail. At the moment, whoever's using it would most likely be liable, but could you then sue the provider? But the biggest concern for law technology is if you don't use it, suppose you don't use a tool and the other side does, and the other side then wins a case because it was using an AI-assisted tool, would you essentially be seen as being negligent, as not doing the best job for the client? And this is an issue that lawyers are now getting quite nervous about. Do they have to then buy the biggest technology they can? Now, the last thing I want to talk about is that my view is that legal technology, it's readily available. It's being used to a certain extent within the legal profession as a time-saving tool, but it's being used more, I think, by in-house lawyers. And I'd be interested in what other people's views are in this, because the work that you can essentially do using AI, using technology, can save a massive amount of time. However, there is a bit of an issue here, and think how private practice lawyers work. If you've ever instructed one and they're not giving you a flat fee, they charge by the hour. We're in this weird situation where if we do something more quickly, it means less pay, because if you're a private practice lawyer, and some people will groan at the sight of this if they've left private practice, because they'll be reminded of it, we all have to complete timesheets. We all essentially have to record our time in 6-minute chunks every day. And if you're not hitting your hours, you get a tap on the shoulder, you're not doing well enough. This, I think, stifles innovation. I think this makes it quite difficult for lawyers within law firms to really use technology, because there's a fear that if they do that, they save time, they're then essentially not billing the client as much as they can. Now, I think the future, and something that I've seen before, is looking at different ways to essentially charge for the work that lawyers are doing. If you're creating technology, your technology is part of the law that you are, the legal job that you are performing. It's something that you should be able to charge for, not just back in the dark ages, charging for the time that you spend on something. And these are all food for thought. These are all things that I think we should discuss in the panel. But that's it for me. I'm sure now we're going to find out how these are all being used in practice.